Imagine, if you will, a world just fundamentally different from ours. A world where every thought, every story, um, every law, every piece of knowledge you had was just gone, like a breath on a cold morning.
It's hard to even picture, isn't it?
Think about it. No written records. Nothing. No ancient scrolls telling tales of your ancestors. No contracts, binding agreements. Not even, a simple grocery list to remind you what you need for dinner.
How would society even work?
Right. How could a society, let alone a really complex civilization, even begin to function? How could knowledge possibly survive beyond a single lifetime or even just one imperfect retelling?
It's an almost impossible scenario for us to truly conceive. Our entire modern world, I mean, from the incredibly intricate legal systems that govern nations down to, well, scribbling a note to ourselves.
Yeah, the shopping list.
Exactly. It's all built on the very foundation of the written word. It's so omnipresent, we rarely even stop to think about it.
And that's precisely what makes today's deep dive so incredibly compelling, I think. We're going to journey back, way back to the very dawn of this monumental invention. We want to unpack the astonishing story of how writing first emerged, a singular moment that really fundamentally shifted humanity's entire trajectory.
It wasn't just a convenient new way to communicate, not at all. It was a revolution, really. A leap from the ephemeral, the spoken word, to something enduring, turning whispers into, well, something permanent.
Exactly, permanence. So, our mission today is to explore the pivotal developments, specifically in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt.
Right. We'll delve into the underlying human needs that sort of acted as the spark for this invention, the ingenious early forms it took, and the distinct yet kind of parallel paths it followed in these two incredibly influential civilizations.
And crucially, we're not just tracing historical steps here. We want to dive deep into the profound and, frankly, monumental impact writing had. Not just on communication, but on the very structure of society, on governance, on how knowledge was accumulated, and ultimately, on the very fabric of human civilization as we know it.
And our main source for this deep dive is The Dawn of Writing, Sumerian and Egyptian scripts. He gives us a really direct and authoritative path to understanding this transformative period.
Okay, so let's begin. Let's unpack this foundational chapter in human history.
To really get our heads around the magnitude of inventing writing, it's essential, I think, that we first try to understand the world before it existed. For tens of thousands of years, human societies relied entirely on oral culture, just speaking and listening.
Passing everything down by word of mouth.
Exactly. Imagine generations of knowledge, wisdom, history, all passed down solely through spoken words, through memory, through recitation. And while that's impressive in its own way, this system had some, well, inherent vulnerabilities, real challenges that became increasingly problematic as human societies got bigger and more complex.
It's almost like a giant, continuous game of telephone, isn't it? You whisper something down the line.
That's a great analogy.
Every time a story or a critical piece of information or maybe a legal precedent was passed down from one person to another, generation to generation, it risked being subtly changed.
Or distorted.
Or forgotten entirely. Or maybe even deliberately altered to fit a new narrative. There was no definitive, unchanging version of anything, was there?
No, knowledge was always fluid,
Yeah.
always susceptible to, well, the vagaries of human memory and interpretation. It's just how memory works.
Right, so information could be easily forgotten or lost completely when key individuals passed away, the elders, the storytellers, the legal experts.
Crucial details, maybe vital for a growing community, could just vanish if the person who held that knowledge wasn't there anymore to share it.
Think about a complex legal ruling or maybe a precise agricultural calendar.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of nuanced information was highly susceptible to embellishment or misunderstanding with each retelling. Accuracy, consistency, it was an ongoing, monumental struggle. Now, for a small, maybe nomadic hunter-gatherer group where social structures were simpler and the amount of essential information was, manageable, this fluidity might have worked okay.
Fewer people, less complex interactions.
Right. But as human communities started that transition, growing larger, more sedentary, settling down, becoming significantly more complex, the sheer volume of information they needed to manage and preserve just became overwhelming, utterly unmanageable through oral means alone.
So this wasn't just about convenience then. It wasn't just, oh, wouldn't it be nice to write this down? It was about a fundamental practical problem that humanity had to solve.
A necessity.
You can only remember so much, right? And you can only trust so many retellings before the details get murky, disputes crop up, and the whole social fabric starts to fray.
Hmm.
The beautiful fluidity of spoken words, while maybe perfect for storytelling and myth-making, was rapidly becoming a nightmare for the practical demands of, say, governing a city or managing a massive food supply.
That's precisely where this escalating need for reliable record-keeping comes into the picture.
Hmm.
As human communities began their really momentous transition, moving from smaller, relatively egalitarian groups to these vast, complex societies,
Yeah.
especially with the revolutionary rise of organized agriculture and the establishment of fixed, permanent settlements,
Yeah.
the demands on their information systems just skyrocketed.
We're talking about the birth of the first cities, essentially, early city-states.
Exactly.
When you have thousands, maybe even tens of thousands, of people living together in one place, specializing in different jobs, trading goods, needing some kind of central authority, some infrastructure, relying on collective memory just wasn't going to cut it anymore.
Not even close. The shift to organized agriculture, especially in super fertile regions like Mesopotamia, meant people were producing significant surplus goods.
More than they needed right away.
Right. Grain, livestock, textiles far beyond immediate consumption. And these surpluses had to be meticulously tracked, stored, and redistributed. It wasn't simple.
Okay, so that leads to complex economies then.
Absolutely. Sophisticated trade networks started developing across vast distances, requiring agreements, receipts, records. Clear property ownership, whether it was land, tools, animals, became vital to avoid constant conflict. And all of this, our source highlights, required meticulous, verifiable tracking. You couldn't just guess.
I can just imagine the practical need. Recording things like, okay, how many seeds do we need for next year's planting? What was the exact yield from this field? How many sheep are in the temple herd? Stuff like that.
And it wasn't just for, keeping track. It was for management, for taxation. These weren't just casual notes. They were absolutely critical for survival, for long-term planning, for the equitable distribution of resources in these burgeoning societies.
Without those records, one bad harvest, one miscounted granary, that could mean famine or maybe widespread revolt.
It could destabilize everything. So if you're a temple manager or royal administrator and you're overseeing the collection of grain from, let's say, 5,000 farmers to feed your entire city,
Yeah.
you need an ironclad way to know who paid what, how much is stored where, and who gets what portion. You simply couldn't rely on the memory of one guy at the granary gate.
That's not just a recipe for chaos. It's a direct path to the collapse of the whole system.
And this need went straight into administrative demands, too. As these early city-states and organized societies emerged, running public affairs became incredibly complex.
Like what kind of things?
Well, managing public works projects, think irrigation canals, vital in Mesopotamia, conscripting laborers, enforcing early legal agreements, managing shared resources like water. All of this became far too intricate for memory alone.
You needed proof, a record.
You needed a verifiable, permanent record of laws, treaties with neighboring cities, census data, complex transactions, just to maintain order and administer justice efficiently.
Which raises a fascinating question, doesn't it? How do you maintain societal order when disputes inevitably arise over land or who owes whom what, if there's no objective, written record to point to?
It becomes very difficult, maybe impossible at scale.
So the ability to record and then verify and enforce information became foundational for maintaining social order, for managing these incredibly complex interactions between thousands of people.
It was a fundamental problem, a huge bottleneck. Humanity desperately needed to solve it. And as we'll see, it led to some truly ingenious and world-changing solutions.
Okay, but before we get to full-blown writing, what came first? Were there steps along the way?
Oh, yes. Definitely. Before we arrive at what we formally recognize as writing, we see these early glimmers, these sort of proto-writing systems. It wasn't a sudden invention, where someone woke up one day and penned a full alphabet. Not at all. Instead, humans developed various symbolic representations that gradually, over centuries, became more sophisticated and abstract.
So these are like the very first baby steps of literacy. Before actual words on a page, we had pictures trying to capture meaning.
Exactly. The most basic form we see are pictograms. Simple, literal pictures representing concrete objects. Think of those early cave paintings or very simple drawings.
A picture of an ox means ox.
Pretty much. A drawing of a wild ox literally meant ox. A drawing of a human meant human. It was the direct, straightforward visual representation of the thing itself. These early efforts, they reflect a really primal human urge to record and communicate beyond just the immediate moment.
I can really picture those early artists trying to capture their world, their experiences, maybe their fears, their food sources. You see those images on ancient cave walls, and you get a very clear sense of this deep-seated human desire to make something permanent, right? To communicate to someone who isn't right there.
And then came this really remarkable progression from simple pictograms to what we call ideograms. This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the pictures started to represent more abstract concepts, not just the object itself.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, an image of an animal's head might evolve to signify food or to eat, moving beyond just animal. An image of a sun might come to signify day or heat.
Ah, okay, so the symbol isn't just the literal thing anymore, it's an idea associated with the thing.
Precisely. This subtle but really profound shift reflects a growing sophistication in human thought and communication, moving from concrete visual representation to abstract conceptual meaning.
That's a truly significant leap. It's like going from drawing a stick figure to mean person, to drawing, I don't know, a heart to mean love, or a light bulb for an idea.
Exactly.
It requires a shared cultural understanding of what that symbol means conceptually, not just visually. The image doesn't show the concept, it represents it.
Indeed. And alongside these evolving pictorial representations, we see the absolutely crucial role of what we call tokens in early economic contexts. These were small, distinctively shaped clay or stone markers.
Like game pieces.
Sort of, but much more important. They serve as direct, tangible precursors to formal writing, especially in that crucial area of commerce and accounting.
So these weren't drawings at all. They were actual physical objects that someone would hold in their hand, little clay shapes.
Yes, precisely. They were used to represent specific quantities or types of goods in trade and economic transactions. Imagine if you're a farmer selling, say, 10 sheep. You might have small, distinct tokens. Maybe one type of token stood for a male sheep, another for a female, maybe another for a lamb, or perhaps a little sphere token meant a measure of grain, and a cone-shaped token meant livestock.
Okay, I see. A physical accounting system.
Exactly. This system provided a tangible, immediately recordable way to track agreements and inventory. It effectively served as a primitive ledger. It was a physical manifestation of an accounting system that moved beyond pure memory.
What's truly fascinating here is how these very physical markers became a crucial step towards abstract symbolic systems. Systems that could record economic data without needing the actual goods present.
Right. You didn't need to physically count out the sheep every single time a transaction happened. You just counted the tokens representing them.
It shows us that the pressing need for economic management was an incredibly powerful driver for the invention of writing. And I read something else. These tokens weren't just loose objects, were they? They led to another innovation.
You're hitting on a critical point there. These tokens often came with an additional layer of innovation that directly bridged the gap to writing. They were sometimes sealed inside hollow clay balls called bullae.
Bullae, like primitive envelopes.
Essentially, yes. To verify a transaction, say, how many sheep were promised, you'd have to break the bulla and count the tokens inside, like opening the envelope.
Okay.
But then, people started pressing the tokens onto the outside of the bulla before sealing them inside, making impressions on the wet clay.
Ah, so you could see what was supposed to be inside without breaking it.
Exactly. This external impression allowed you to read the contents without breaking the seal. And this was a profoundly crucial step. Once you could represent the quantity and type of goods by simply pressing a symbol the token's shape onto the surface of the clay.
Then the tokens inside and even the bullet itself weren't really needed anymore.
They became redundant. You could just impress those symbols directly onto a flat piece of clay, a clay tablet, which led directly to the idea of a flat, portable written ledger.
That's an incredible thought process. The need to verify the contents of a sealed container basically gives birth to the concept of a written document.
Wow.
It's not just some abstract intellectual development. It's born from the very practical challenges of managing an early economy.
And this brings us, finally, to the very cradle of writing as we usually think of it, Mesopotamia. This is where the first, truly definitive writing system really burst onto the scene.
Indeed, Mesopotamia, often called the Fertile Crescent, referring to those incredibly rich lands nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Modern-day Iraq, basically.
Right, a region renowned for giving birth to civilization itself. Those twin rivers provided the lifeblood for agriculture in an otherwise pretty arid region, creating extraordinary fertility.
It sounds like an environment that was almost purpose-built for developing complex societies. Absolutely. The abundance of water and fertile soil supported these unprecedentedly large populations, which in turn led to the rapid development of complex urban centers. Powerful city-states like Uruk, Lagash. This environment fostered dense, organized societies that desperately needed robust, permanent systems for administration, communication, managing vast resources.
It was like an ecosystem of necessity.
Exactly. It provided the ideal pressure and context for writing to develop organically, really out of sheer societal demand.
So this wasn't just a random flash of genius somewhere. It was a highly practical, urgent solution to a very pressing set of problems in a very specific, advanced societal context. The conditions were right.
Precisely. And it was the Sumerians, the people who inhabited this southern Mesopotamian region, who are unequivocally credited with developing the first definitive writing system. This happened between approximately 3300 and 3100 BCE.
Okay.
Their burgeoning city-states, with their highly sophisticated social, economic, religious lives, they created an urgent, undeniable need to record everything.
Like what?
Temple assets, intricate trade agreements, royal decrees, the precise lineage of kings. Everything needed to be written down.
And this groundbreaking system we're talking about is, of course, cuneiform. That name just sounds ancient and mysterious.
It does, doesn't it? And that name is perfectly descriptive. Cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped, from the Latin cuneus for wedge. And that perfectly describes its distinctive look. It was created using a remarkably practical and abundant medium, clay. Professional scribes would press pointed reed styluses into soft, malleable clay tablets.
Reed styluses, just sharpened reeds.
Essentially, yes. The triangular tip of the stylus, when pressed into the wet clay, would leave those characteristic wedge-shaped marks, which form the individual characters.
That sounds like a remarkably efficient method, actually, given the materials they had. Clay is incredibly abundant in Mesopotamia.
Everywhere.
And once those tablets were dried in the sun, or even better, baked in a kiln, they'd become incredibly durable, right? Essentially permanent records.
They were. Their remarkable durability is precisely why we have hundreds of thousands of them today. It gives us this unparalleled, detailed window into Sumerian life, their thoughts, their entire civilization. But the true genius, the really revolutionary aspect, lies in the evolution of cuneiform itself. It started its journey, much like the proto-writing we discussed, entirely with simple pictorial symbols.
Pictures again.
Right. If you wanted to represent an ox, you drew a recognizable picture of an ox. If you needed to record grain, you drew a stalk of barley. Pretty straightforward.
Simple enough. Draw what you see, what you need to record.
But over time, these pictorial symbols went through this fascinating transformation. They became increasingly stylized, more abstract, often rotated 90 degrees even, moving away from direct, literal pictorial representation.
Why did they do that? Just faster to write.
Largely, yes. The detailed ox drawing might become just a few quick strokes, an abstract arrangement of wedges that represented an ox, rather than a detailed picture. This shift was driven by the need for efficiency, standardization. Scribes needed to write faster and more consistently across lots of documents.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Because pictograms, even ideograms that represent concepts, they can only take you so far, right?
Yeah.
How do you record something as complex as a detailed legal code? Or a nuanced story, a philosophical thought, a solemn prayer? If you're just drawing pictures of objects or simple abstract concepts, you can't really draw justice or hope easily.
This is the monumental part, the revolutionary leap.
Yeah.
Cuneiform evolved to represent not just objects or ideas, but sounds.
Sounds, like spoken language.
The actual sounds of spoken language, and by extension, entire words, even abstract ones. This was achieved through a brilliant innovation called the rebus principle.
The rebus principle, like those puzzles.
Exactly like those puzzles. Imagine taking the pictogram for a bee and combining it with the pictogram for a leaf. You're not trying to convey a literal bee on a leaf.
Okay.
Instead, you're using the sounds these pictures represent, the sound bee and the sound leaf, to form a new abstract word, belief.
Wow. Belief. Belief. Okay, that's clever.
It was groundbreaking. This phonetic leap meant that writing could now express the full complexity, the nuance, the dramatical structure of spoken language, not just concrete items or simple concepts.
So its usefulness just exploded.
Exponentially, far beyond basic economic records.
So what does this fundamental shift mean for human thought, for society? It means writing transformed from just a clever accounting tool into a truly universal vehicle for capturing the entire breadth of human thought, culture, emotion.
Everything.
It meant writing could capture subtle nuances of meaning, elaborate narratives, highly complex legal structures, even the most intricate poetic language. This was the birth of true literacy as we understand it.
And we see this profound expansion reflected in how they used it. While initially, yes, primarily used for crucial economic transactions, diligently recording how much grain was in the temple storerooms, the exact number of animals in royal herds, details of land sales.
The practical stuff.
Right. But with its new phonetic capabilities, its use broadened dramatically. We find cuneiform used in highly detailed legal documents, like early law codes, the Code of Ornamu, for instance, which actually predates Hammurabi by centuries.
Real, older than Hammurabi's code.
Yep. It was used for intricate literary texts, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great epic poem, preserved for millennia thanks to cuneiform.
Incredible.
And it was used for profound religious scriptures, hymns, prayers, even scientific and mathematical tables, astronomy, calculations.
And the medium, those clay tablets, was absolutely key to its longevity, wasn't it? That's why we had them.
Absolutely. Clay tablets had significant, almost perfect advantages for their purpose and environment. When wet, they were easily pliable, surprisingly portable. Scribes could work on them anywhere, even on the move.
And then they dried hard as rock.
Right. Once dried in the harsh Mesopotamian sun, or for more important documents baked in a kiln, they became incredibly durable, resistant to fire, pests, the ravages of time. This made them ideal for long-term archiving, creating these enduring libraries of human knowledge.
And we found lots of them.
Oh, thousands upon thousands. Our earliest concrete evidence of this system, found in the ancient city of Uruk, consists of thousands of these tablets, meticulously documenting product stocks, detailed trade agreements, complex temple assets, providing us with our very first comprehensive glimpses into organized, written history.
And with this new, complex, vital system came a new, highly specialized, and incredibly powerful role in society: the scribe.
Indeed, professional scribes emerged as a distinct, highly privileged, and immensely powerful class in Mesopotamian society. Their specialized knowledge, their literacy, in a world where the vast majority were illiterate, gave them immense social standing, authority.
They were the gatekeepers.
Absolutely. The essential gatekeepers of all information, controlling everything from legal records and administrative documents to historical chronicles and religious texts. They effectively held the keys to the kingdom, wielding significant political and economic influence.
And getting into scribal school wasn't easy, I bet.
No, access was typically reserved for the elite. The training was rigorous, took many years. This reinforced existing social hierarchies.
It makes perfect sense, though. If you're one of the very few who can read and write the laws, manage the city's wealth, draft diplomatic letters, you're not just important, you are absolutely indispensable.
Your skill isn't just a job, it's a source of immense power.
Okay, so while all this is happening, cuneiform flourishing in Mesopotamia, something equally remarkable but different was unfolding elsewhere.
Yes, across another great river valley.
You're talking about ancient Egypt now, right? Land of pharaohs, pyramids.
Exactly. And it's crucial to emphasize this. A completely distinct writing system developed independently in ancient Egypt, roughly around the same time as in Mesopotamia, beginning around 3200 BCE.
Independently. So they didn't borrow the idea.
The evidence strongly suggests independent development. This wasn't just one culture borrowing from another. And this independent emergence, I think, powerfully underscores a kind of universal human drive for communication and record-keeping. Its development in Egypt was deeply rooted in the unique environment of the Nile River civilization, a land defined by its predictable floods, a highly centralized pharaonic power, and this profound emphasis on monumental architecture and the afterlife.
So two distinct civilizations, thousands of miles apart, both came up with the idea of writing around the same time. That really speaks to a fundamental human need, doesn't it? It's almost as if when societies hit a certain level of complexity, writing had to emerge.
It truly does seem that way.
Yeah.
In Egypt, the writing system that emerged is what we know as hieroglyphs.
Hieroglyphs, everyone knows those images.
Right. And the name itself, from Greek, means sacred carving, which gives you an immediate clue about its primary function and its revered status.
Sacred carving.
Okay. Hieroglyphs are visually complex, incredibly detailed, often exquisitely beautiful. They are in many ways works of art embedded within a communication system.
They really are captivating. When you look at them, they're not just symbols. They're miniature pictures, almost like a story in themselves.
And like cuneiform, hieroglyphs were a sophisticated mixed system. They combine pictograms, pictures representing objects.
Like a bird for bird.
Right, and ideograms, pictures representing concepts. And crucially, phonetic signs, symbols representing sounds, all within the same system. So a single symbol could function as an image, an idea, or a sound, depending on the context.
Complicated.
Very. However, while hieroglyphs were certainly functional for administration, they carried a very strong sacred and official function. They were predominantly used in religious texts, meticulously carved onto the walls of temples and tombs, inside sarcophagi, on monumental stelae.
So less about daily business, more about the big stuff. Gods and kings.
To a large extent, yes, especially in their most formal presentation. The Egyptians didn't just see writing as a mere tool for everyday communication. They viewed it as an integral part of their art, their cosmology, their sacred knowledge, infused with deep spiritual significance. Even magic.
Magic.
Yes, the act of writing, especially names or spells, was believed to have power, to make things real, to make them eternal. To carve words into stone was to grant them power over reality and the afterlife.
That's a really key distinction from the more sort of utilitarian beginnings of cuneiform, even though cuneiform also grew into sacred texts later. It suggests for the Egyptians, writing was almost a divine act itself, a way to connect with the gods, ensure eternal life.
Very much so. And their choice of writing materials also differed significantly from Mesopotamia. While Mesopotamians primarily used that durable, abundant clay,
The Egyptians had something else.
they made innovative and widespread use of papyrus, a material derived from the papyrus plant, which grew abundantly along the Nile riverbanks.
Papyrus, the original paper, that feels revolutionary too.
It really was. Its advantages were significant. It was light, highly portable, easily storable, especially when rolled into scrolls.
Easier to carry around than clay tablets, I bet.
Much easier. This greatly facilitated the widespread use of writing throughout Egypt, not just for monumental inscriptions, but also for daily administrative records, legal documents, letters, literary works. Papyrus allowed for a more fluid, less cumbersome writing process than pressing into clay.
But they still carved into stone too, right? We see hieroglyphs on temples and tombs everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. Hieroglyphs were also meticulously carved into stone and painted on walls. These are the monumental, enduring records designed to last for eternity, perfectly aligning with that sacred function we talked about.
Okay, and what about the scribes in Egypt? Did they hold a similar powerful position to the Mesopotamian ones? Were they also the gatekeepers of knowledge?
Absolutely. Egyptian scribes, known as sesh, held an exceptionally highly respected and elite position in society, arguably even more central to the state's functioning, maybe because of the highly centralized nature of pharaonic rule.
Sesh.
Okay. Literacy in ancient Egypt was confined to a specially educated class, mostly male, making their knowledge a central pillar of administrative, religious, and cultural power.
What did they actually do?
Oh, everything. They managed the pharaoh's granaries, collected taxes, drafted laws, conducted censuses, maintained temple rituals, copied religious texts, even wrote down the magic spells for the Book of the Dead.
Wow, so pretty essential.
Completely. Their path to becoming a scribe was arduous, often starting in childhood, involving years of rigorous training in special schools, sometimes called the House of Life.
House of Life. Sounds important.
It was. This intense education reinforced that strong link between knowledge, authority, and social mobility, though, again, mobility was largely limited to this elite class.
And we have evidence of this early Egyptian writing.
Plenty. Archaeological evidence, like the Narmer palette, one of the earliest examples of Egyptian hieroglyphs, dates to around 3100 BCE. It clearly shows its early use for royal declarations, recording unification, monumental records. And similarly, countless papyri have been found, documenting everything from medical treatments to complex land deeds, poems, letters.
So in both these incredibly influential civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt, you have these highly skilled individuals, the scribes, who are the essential gatekeepers of information and therefore of power. It really makes you pause and think about how access to information and the ability to interpret it, maybe manipulate it, still dictates power dynamics in our world today, doesn't it?
It's a striking parallel, absolutely. And it leads us directly to think about the profound, the lasting societal impact of writing. It goes far beyond just facilitating communication. This invention quite literally reshaped organized human society.
I can certainly imagine. No more relying on someone's, fallible memory for critical tax records or legal precedents. The sheer inefficiency of that older system must have been crippling for large-scale governance.
Precisely. Writing became the fundamental cornerstone of any organized state. Governments could now formalize complex legal systems. They would accurately, consistently levy taxes across vast populations. They could manage public administration with unprecedented efficiency, communicate royal decrees across an empire without distortion.
Before writing, trying to run a large state must have been incredibly difficult, prone to collapse.
Extremely difficult to sustain. With writing, you could create a lasting, verifiable bureaucracy, a truly scalable system of governance that oral traditions could never support. This allowed for the emergence of larger, more complex, more stable empires.
And you mentioned power structures. Writing solidified and reinforced social hierarchies too, didn't it?
Undeniably. The emergence of those professional scribes as a distinct, highly privileged class in both Mesopotamia and Egypt powerfully demonstrates that tangible link between access to knowledge literacy and the exercise of power and influence.
If you can read and write, you're in charge, basically.
Those who possess the rare ability controlled information. And information then as now meant power. It absolutely created a powerful elite. The ability to understand, create, interpret the written word was a skill held by a tiny minority, making those few individuals invaluable.
Literacy was a marker of status.
A path to prestige, a tool for control. It reinforced existing power structures, even allowed for new forms of social control through codified laws and records that everyone else couldn't read.
And this complexity of writing, especially in its early, intricate forms like hieroglyphs or early cuneiform, that necessitated something else monumental. Formal education. You couldn't just pick this up on your own.
Exactly right. You needed dedicated, rigorous training, which led to the establishment of the first formal educational institutions, the scribal schools.
And this had another huge effect, right, on knowledge itself.
A massive effect. For the very first time in human history, cultural knowledge, detailed historical accounts, complex scientific, mathematical, philosophical ideas could be reliably preserved and transmitted across generations without that constant fear of loss or distortion.
That's truly revolutionary.
It allowed for the cumulative accumulation of collective wisdom. Societies didn't have to constantly reinvent the wheel or relearn lessons from scratch. Knowledge could build upon itself generation after generation.
This is the true birth of recorded history, then, of literature, of systematic science.
Absolutely. That ability to record and build upon previous generations' discoveries and insights is what allows for that exponential growth in human knowledge. It's how we move from basic survival to true civilization in many ways.
And thinking back to the independent emergence, writing popping up separately in Mesopotamia and Egypt, that's really remarkable.
It really is. It powerfully underscores a universal human need for efficient communication, meticulous record-keeping, durable knowledge preservation. A need that transcended specific cultures, unique environments. It wasn't merely a local invention. It feels like a fundamental human drive that manifested in different forms when the conditions were right.
It's almost as if when societies reached a certain level of complexity, a certain scale, the invention of writing wasn't just helpful. It was almost an inevitable, necessary response.
In many ways, yes. It was a solution born out of those pressing needs that arose with large-scale agriculture, urban centers, centralized states, and finally, perhaps most importantly, both cuneiform and hieroglyphs laid the absolutely foundational groundwork for all subsequent writing systems that followed. Alphabets, syllabaries. They all ultimately trace back to these origins.
So this invention directly enabled the development of entire fields of human endeavor that we just take for granted now.
Think about it. History, allowing narratives to be recorded, analyzed. Literature, through the creation of epic poems, stories, drama. Law, providing codified, stable legal frameworks that can be consistently applied. Science and mathematics, enabling the systematic recording, transmission, accumulation of observations, experiments, theoretical discoveries.
Without a stable, enduring medium for their creation and dissemination, these fields, as we know them, simply couldn't have developed.
They couldn't exist in the way they do.
What an incredible journey we've taken. From, simple pictures on cave walls and little clay tokens to these complex phonetic systems that captured the full scope of human thought, human emotion. The invention of writing really flourishing between, say, 3300 and 2800 BCE. It was truly a monumental leap, a pivot point for humanity.
Indeed. Cuneiform and hieroglyphs didn't just record human activity. They fundamentally shaped human thought, restructured cultures, and built the very political and economic frameworks that, in many ways, still underpin our world today. They transformed the very way we interact with knowledge, with authority, and ultimately with each other. across time, across generations.
And it really makes you think about our own time, doesn't it? In
Mm.
this age of, well, ubiquitous digital information, constant communication, increasingly powerful AI, are we perhaps facing a new set of challenges? Challenges regarding information preservation, reliability, access. In some fascinating ways, it feels almost reminiscent of the pre-writing era's limitations. You
Uh-huh.
know, the fragility of oral tradition, but on a vastly different, maybe even more overwhelming scale.
It raises an important, maybe even provocative question for you, our listener, to think about. How does the form of our communication today?
Mm.
Think about the fleeting nature of social media posts versus carefully curated digital archives. The ephemeral video versus the preserved text. How does that impact the permanence and the very understanding of our own historical record for future generations?
Yeah, what will people find?
What might an archaeologist millennia from now actually unearth from our digital ruins? And what story, what truths, what insights would that fragmented digital record tell about our information-rich but potentially incredibly ephemeral age?
Something to ponder as you navigate your own information landscape today. And maybe consider which of your own thoughts you might want to make permanent.